Hello and welcome to Production Bites. I'm your host Veranova, and today I'm going to be giving you some tips on how to program natural sounding drums. So let's jump right into it. The first things you need to understand when programming acoustic instruments digitally is that acoustic instruments are much less predictable than a digital sample. However, there are certain variables which you can predict, such as the positioning on the drum skin or the surface of the cymbal, which will dictate the timbre or tone of the sound, how hard you hit the cymbal or drum, which will dictate the loudness or velocity, and it will also dictate the tone by adding overtones the harder you hit it. So when you're programming, try and think about these variables and remember that you are imitating an acoustic sound, and digital samples aren't very good at imitating that themselves. In fact, a lot of dedicated drum samplers will use multiple recordings where the drum has been hit at multiple velocities and is mapped to the MIDI velocity. So right here, I've got a drum loop which I've already prepared, and each of the drums are already mapped to relevant mixer tracks, and all of these mixer tracks have been sent to a drums bus, which then goes on to the master. I also have a reverb send set up, but I'm not using that yet. So here's what my loop currently sounds like. Okay, so I can hear a ton of problems with this if I'm trying to make it sound natural, and I'm just going to work my way through them and transform this loop into something which a drummer would actually play. So first of all, I want to think about the velocities of the samples. A drummer doesn't hit the drum every single time at the exact same velocity. It does vary a bit. So if I go through this one by one and make some little tweaks, just a little bit of randomization, or I can articulate it in a more controlled manner if I want to get a good effect. So this is pretty much just randomly putting in different velocities, and this is what it sounds like now. So you can hear here on the double kick drum, it actually sounds a lot more natural than just being at one velocity, which is this. So I'm going to go through the drums now and just do this a little bit on every single drum. Here on these hats, I've actually decided to articulate it in a more controlled manner as it will get me a good effect. So I'm making every other hat more powerful than the intermediate hats. Okay, so now I've programmed in some different velocity mappings on each of these samples, just to make it sound a bit more natural, and this is what it sounds like now. So that definitely has a lot more life in it now, compared to the original drum loop. Now the next thing to think about when you're programming in drums is that you've only got 2 hands as a drummer and 2 feet. And that means that on your right foot you'll probably have your kick drum and you can kick that at any point, but you are limited in the speed at which you can kick it. And on your left foot you'll have the pedal for the hi-hat, which will allow you to close and open it. So anytime I'm using a closed hi-hat, I can't then be using my left foot for anything else. So if I had a double kick pedal to do fast kick rolls, then I wouldn't be able to close the hi-hat at that point. However, in the case of this loop, a lot of drummers can play kicks this fast with just one foot, so I'm going to leave the closed hi-hat and the kick drum playing at the same time because I think a drummer could actually manage that with one foot for the kick. Also, you've only got 2 hands, so you can only hit the snare and the hat at the same time. You can't be hitting a snare hat and a cymbal or a tom at the same time. And if you want to do a flam on the snare, you can only hit the snare, because that takes 2 sticks coming down on the snare at once. So having a look at this again, I need to decide whether this is actually possible to play. So in this first beat, I've got a crash and I'm also hitting the closed hi-hat. Now that's fine, that's both hands being used. But on the second beat here, I'm hitting the snare, the closed hi-hat, and the crash. So one of these has to come out. And in this case, I'm going to take out the hat on the second beat just to accent it, and then take out the crashes thereafter, as the hi-hat, the kick and the snare generally make up the rhythm, so you want to keep them in. And here, in fact, I've also got some toms. Now I need a hand to hit the tom, and because these toms are so fast, the drummer will actually be using two hands probably to drum it. So I'm going to have to take out all of these hats, and these crashes as well. And just so I've got a little bit of treble during the toms, I'm actually going to take out the hat here and put in a cymbal. Also, another thing I've just noticed is that these hi-hats here, the faster section, just like with the tom rolls, you're going to need two hands to play that probably. So I'm going to have to take out either the crash or the hat here, and I think I'll take out the crash because the hats are an integral part of the rhythm. So now the drum loop sounds like this. The next thing to think about when you're programming drums is that when you hit a drum, it will ring out, but then when you hit it again, it will reset to the start of its hit and ring out all over again. Now, if you've got two samples playing, and the tail of one sample overlaps the start of the next sample, you're effectively going to have two of exactly the same drum playing at once. So you need to have a way to stop the same drum sample overlapping, and that's actually what I've got going on in the toms if you have a listen. So you can hear in the ring that there's actually some interference. The tone is phasing, and that's because you've got two of exactly the same drum playing at once, and the low end of the two identical samples is interfering with each other. So the way I solve this is in FL Studio, I can go into the sampler and go to the miscellaneous tab, and here I've got a box called Cut and Cut By. Now this sets up cut groups. So my cut by control will determine which cut group, when it's activated, will stop this sample playing. And if I set both to 1, this means that it will be cut by cut group 1, and also it will cut group 1. So that means if this sample plays and then it's triggered again, the previous activation of the sample will stop. And I'm just going to solo this so you can listen. So you can hear the low end's a lot cleaner now. Now you don't have to do this if you don't want to, but it does make the drums sound a lot better. And you can make this quicker also by just hitting cut itself, which will automatically set up a blank cut group. And I'll do this on all of the drums now. Okay, so now every drum is in a cut group, and this sounds like this. Now the other thing you have to think about with this as well is that drums have different articulations. So here I've got a closed hi-hat, and here I've got an open hi-hat. And you'll see right now they're in a different cut group. However, it's on the same hi-hat, so surely you can't have both samples playing at the same time. So if I now set these to the same cut group, only one of these will be able to play at any one time. That sounds like this. So now this is sounding a lot better than it was. But when you're using an acoustic instrument, as I said before, the sound you get is not predictable, although there are some variables which you can predict. So for the kick, for instance, it's playing exactly the same sample every time it kicks. And where I've got this double kick here, you hear exactly the same click, and it just sounds digital and unnatural. So to get around this, you can use multiple different recordings of the same drum or cymbal. And right here I've got my samples, which I picked out earlier, and I'm just going to put in a second kick drum, and then replace this kick here, and also remap the velocity because it was brought down a little bit. And let's have a listen to that kick drum now. So now you can hear clearly it's a different kick sample, and it just makes it sound more natural. And I can do the same for the hi-hat here, because it's playing exactly the same sample every time here. I'll just bring down the level of this, because on these I did actually bring down the level in the velocities, but this is a much faster way of doing it. And this sounds like this. So now the hi-hat sounds a lot less static when it's playing quickly, and you can go one step further and put in another hi-hat sample, so it doesn't just sound like it's switching between two samples the whole time. And I can also do this for the toms, which I've also got several samples of. And this will make a big difference, as right now the toms do sound incredibly static. Okay, so now I've been through and I've multi-sampled every hit. I now have 3 snares which are alternating. I now have 2 kicks which are alternating. I also have alternating toms and alternating hats. And let's have a listen to this. So it does sound a lot better now. The last thing to do with a drum kit like this is you'll notice that this is entirely mono, it's in the middle. But a drum kit is spread all over a soundstage, and it's also in an environment, it's in a room, so you'll need to add reverb. The first thing to do, therefore, is to pan all of your drums. And the usual way to do this, although it's not a rule, is to have your kick and snare and your hi-hats in the middle, although if you actually look at the drum kit, you'll know that they're not. This is the kind of modern way of doing it, but it's not a set rule. The crash, however, I can put on one side. And you also need to remember, if you do decide to pan the hi-hats, that the open and closed hi-hat, because they are the same cymbal, need to be panned to exactly the same place. And toms, again, you can roll them round like so. And let's have a listen to this. And lastly, because your drum kit is in an environment, if you bus off your drums and then send the bus to a reverb, then it will sound like it's in a space now. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. Now, although I've worked really hard to make these drums sound natural and I'm using multiple samples, multiple velocities, I've panned everything as I should, it still sounds quite programmed. And there's not really a lot I can do about that because it is programmed. There are drum samplers which do a much better job of this. They're in much better detail, they use random samples, they have different velocities of samples mapped across the MIDI velocities, and they just sound a lot better. One such plugin for this is Easy Drummer. So I've copied this loop into Easy Drummer, and I've muted the original loop's bus, and this is what it sounds like using a really quite good sampler. So it definitely sounds a lot better versus this. Although using samples is definitely a lot more punchy without extra production to make it sound punchy. So that's it for this episode of Production Bites. I hope this tutorial helped. Remember, if you've got any suggestions for future tutorials, then head over to our Facebook page and leave a comment suggesting it. I'm going to put this project up for download so you can have a play yourself and see what I've done. And as always, please like, comment and subscribe. See you next time.